In contrast with the past few decades, Salafi jihadist terrorists pose a relatively low threat to the United States at this time. Instead, the main threat facing the US and many of our allies comes from what we've traditionally thought of as domestic ideologies. Things like anti-government sentiment, white supremacy, violent misogyny. All of these things are driving far more of the violent extremist activity that we're seeing today. And these networks are increasingly transnational in their operations and communications. Hi, I'm Catrina Doxsee, a fellow with the Transnational Threats Project, and I'm here to talk about my recent report with the Transnational Threats team, the Global Terrorism Threat Assessment 2024. In this report, we set out to analyze the terrorism threat to the United States and its allies. We focused both on top-line threat assessments pertaining to the threat the US and its allies will be facing in the short to medium term, as well as taking a deeper dive into the threat environment in each of the world's regions. For about 2 decades after the September 11th attacks, the US was completely focused on counterterrorism missions. Now we're dealing with a much wider range of threats when we think about security and defense, whether that's looking at adversaries like China and Russia, including the ongoing war in Ukraine, looking at issues like climate change, forced migration, diseases like the COVID-19 pandemic. All of these things are competing for our time, attention, and resources. We wanted to be able to assess the overall landscape around the world for terrorist threats, and recognizing that terrorism will always persist as a problem, understand how pressing the threat currently is, and how that should inform our attempts to balance policy across all of the different security concerns facing the US today. One big takeaway is that in contrast with the past few decades, Salafi jihadist terrorists pose a relatively low threat to the United States at this time. Instead, the main threat facing the US and many of our allies comes from what we've traditionally thought of as domestic ideologies. Things like anti-government sentiment, white supremacy, violent misogyny. All of these things are driving far more of the violent extremist activity that we're seeing today. And these networks are increasingly transnational in their operations and communications. We do see that international events can still spark outbursts of violence and extremism in a place like the United States, as we've seen even recently following the conflict between Israel and Hamas. However, this is also exacerbating many of those underlying domestic tensions already, including anti-Semitism, racism, and other factors that are driving domestic terrorism in the United States. We hope the report will help to inform the larger policy space by providing a general overview of the threats facing the United States from terrorist actors, as well as giving context to some particular regional concerns that policymakers may have. Overall, we want to contextualize the terrorism threat against a backdrop of other security and defense concerns that policymakers are facing, because we know that terrorism is going to persist as a threat, and we want to make sure that we best understand where that threat is coming from and how we can best allocate resources and prioritize these challenges as we seek to keep the American people and our allies safe. To read the full report, please visit csis.org.